The child sex ratio now has become one of the major concerns in contemporary India, and one of the reasons for this is that it is an all-time low. It was 914. The way we measured it in India is the number of girls per 1,000 boys. So 914 in 2011 compared to 927 in 2001 simply means the problem is not just not going away, it's actually getting worse. Till now, I think, till 2001, there was some complacency because the feeling was, well, it's confined mainly to northwest India, to certain districts in Tamil Nadu, where maybe cultural or other reasons can be put in place to try and understand what's going on. However, 2011 was extremely disturbing for us because it showed spread to parts of the country from center to the east to even the northeast, believe it or not, and disturbing signs coming from South India, Andhra Pradesh, and even, I would say, qualitative not so much, not in terms of numbers, but qualitative information evidence that even a marvelous state like Kerala, which has been much usually in the news for having a relatively high status for women, is in fact seeing the entry of sex selection as a practice. One of the ways, of course, we do think of it is as a matter of violence. And violence understood here, and let me make this very clear, violence not understood as genocide and murder, which is possibly how some people would like to think missing girls should be understood. I would think of it as a preemptive form of violence. That is to say, particularly the practice of sex selection, when you decide before birth that you do not wish to bring a girl into the world, which is after all a right you do have under general rights of abortion. But this kind of sex selection, I would call it a form of preemptive violence rather than outright violence. Secondly, I think why we need to temper a kind of just looking at it as yet another mode of violence against women is precisely the point that these declines have happened precisely in the very decades that have seen the highest rates of growth in our country. So the difficult question becomes, how do we bring these two facts together? We can always understand discrimination and poverty leading to neglect and therefore the death of girls. Why should high rates of growth go hand in hand with this phenomenon? And which is precisely why a violence perspective is not sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient, and we must bring in what we think of as the larger political economy of the period, whereby in a very how shall I say, counterintuitive and problematic way, actually things that we think are good, that is to say, things that we think of as girls going to school, what could be worse than that? Girls going to school, girls accessing higher education, the size of families coming down, in other words, women no longer being burdened by frequent childbirth and lots of children, ages of marriage going up. Now, what could be wrong with any of those? But what we are discovering, and this is what I think makes the issue particularly challenging, is that these very good modern progressive things can turn into reasons why a girl is seen as an even greater burden than before. In other words, you cannot anymore, if you are outside of absolute poverty, you want to have a daughter, you actually want good things for her. You want her to eat well, you don't want her to starve, you want her to go to school, if possible maybe have a college degree, you want her to marry well, which also means give her a good dowry, and the list just goes on. And this again means that we must pay closer attention to the nature of the economic prosperity that India has witnessed. Unlike other parts of the world, it hasn't gone hand in hand with high rates of employment. So we have followed a path, what we call the low road of high growth, which is service sector driven, real estate driven, does not generate jobs, least of all for girls. So in other words, we see some of the lowest rates of paid work. I mean, I don't know how well known this fact is, but the proportion of women today who have any kind of paid work, that is work for which they get paid, is 15%. And imagine out of that 15%, the largest proportion will be actually onerous work that is done for survival in agricultural labor, in urban India's domestic workers. In other words, not the kind of jobs that many of us would want to aspire for. For the better, I would rather emphasize, along with all the advocacy that may be there, much more focused research. In other words, we badly need to understand why this is happening. Why would it be that families who may not be absolutely in a situation of poverty nonetheless make these kinds of decisions, and why would this spread to other parts of India, and what can we do to, if we understand the dynamic better, because a lot of the dynamic actually boils down to small families, 1 or 2 children, at least 1 son, at most 1 daughter. Let's look at the families with only girls, for instance, and ask ourselves, okay, can we get a better sense of how and why such families are coping? Do they actually welcome the daughters? Do they see them only as a burden? And can we look here to trends of change? Because in the end of the day, that's going to be where the change comes. That is to say, families who are happy to have a girl when a girl is announced.